Hello, here we are May 18th, 2015, looking at my prototype radio box. This was kind of the prototype that I've been working with for the last few years. It's worked out very well, but time to move on to something that will be a little more space efficient. In the meantime, I want to document what I've done with this one for possible future consumption. This box I acquired from one of the hardware stores, just pretty much your basic storage box, usual plastic and whatnot. As you can see here, for reference, this is the radio in here is the ASU 857, all mode, HF, UHF, VHF, pretty much everything under the sun that I could ever want or use. So if you're familiar with that radio, you'll notice that all the ports here actually match up with that. You'll notice the ports for microphone and the radio head. Standard plug-ins RJ45, and I never remember if this is RJ11 or RJ10, but also standard, easily acquirable from a number of sources online. The actual ports here and the faces I also acquired online fairly inexpensively. An Anderson plug here, and UHF, VHF, and then HF plug, external speaker, and then a handy ground lug where all the internals are actually grounded to this point. I have a ground strap in the vehicle. Looking at the sides, I kind of jury-rigged a bit of a cooling system. I use masonite to cover the actual hole where I have the fan. Just a couple of basic 12-volt computer fans for all intents and purposes on both sides, one push, one pull. And again, this worked out fairly well. The airflow coming in underneath, ensuring that most of the stuff around the box didn't interfere too much with the flow. The handles here kept most things away, so there's plenty of space here, whether this is pushing or pulling. Although it's interesting to note, for a box of this size, I was actually intending to put in some thermal switches. Never did, because I had a hard time finding the actual switches I wanted. My first order ended up being the wrong switches, and I just never got around to doing the right switches. But I never ended up needing the fans. The thing never overheated. Never had a problem. Lots and lots of space in this particular box, which made it a great prototype. Going to the internals, I actually went a little fancy on the inside. This top panel, masonite, worked out very well. Here's my switch for the fans. I just went manual on it. Again, rarely used it. If I was out on a hot day, I'd go ahead and flip them on, but never had a problem. Went with a fancy switch, very nice switch. I actually forget the specs offhand, but acquired this switch as kind of a master power. Again, worked out very well. Pretty much a hard cut. Some of you in the power industry or machinery might recognize this is a heavy-duty switch, probably over switched, but it works very well. And you'll see the access port for my LDG Z100 Plus auto tuner. Hole's a little bit too big. I miscut on the first cut and had to cut a second time. But easy access, pop the hatch, hit the button, everything's visible. Very easy. And to actually access the internals, one wing nut and pop the hatch. Now, inside here, I have to unplug a few things here. I used Anderson plugs pretty much universally. Very nice standard. I pretty much discovered Anderson plugs on this. Love them. Had a hard time discovering how to actually employ them, but you notice Anderson plugs here, the fans, one black, two red. Obviously two fans on the one switch. So, looking at the guts of this thing, Some of you experts will probably note that it's a little bit messy in here, mostly because I learned on this box and this is the first try out. The tuner, I went with a central wall where I mounted the tuner and the power distribution box to the 857 mounted here. I could never really decide if the cooling system in here was that good given all the obstacles, but again, the space was so big this thing never actually overheated. Plenty of nylon standoffs to try to keep some semblance of airflow. RG8X going from the external ports, PL259, PL258, SO239. I never remember those things at this late hour. Again, a little bit messy, but for a first time prototype, not so bad. I attempted to seal up everything as best I could. Obviously nothing's perfect in this scenario, but this would at least keep the rain out for the most part. Yeah, I can swap out the cables. The cable here is actually Cat 6 communications cable salvaged from another application. They were ripping them out and throwing away. I glommed onto it and have put it to pretty good use. It's a little stiff, hard to work with, but again, for my purposes, it worked out nice. The downside of this is it's actually difficult to access the front as well as the back of the radio. This orientation, I was never able to find a good orientation to better the access, but again, prototypes. You see the back of the radio. Some ports I did not mimic, either because of value or because I just couldn't find the ports. Those of you familiar with the 857 are familiar with the two ports underneath here and here. I'm not familiar with the exact term for them. There are some kind of data plugs for control and for other purposes on the 857, and I haven't been able to locate the actual chassis mounts for those. And it takes a little bit of extra work that I just never had time for and never really had the need for them anyway. Next version I'm going to try to do better. But it's been a good box. Not a bad setup for a first time. Lots of space. Now, yeah, my camera person is zooming in on it. This was just a random little plug. Pull that out. Basically, these fans are computer fans. You'll note the fairly common connector. I cut off the black and the red. The yellow, I believe, is a information on RPMs and whatnot. Possibly control. I don't remember the specs, but I just left that intact just in case I decided to resurrect these as computer fans or some other purpose, but I left the plug in place. A lot of the fans you find out, the new fans for the next box are the same way, that the same plug. I'm going to actually attempt to convert this plug onto Anderson, do away with the third plug, but get a little bit of additional compatibility so I can actually not have to chop things up quite so much. But you know, the nice thing about having all this extra space is I could actually have a lot of extra junk going around. As I mentioned earlier, the grounding is pretty universal. Everything that can have a ground goes to ground. There's a one common ground that goes to the ground lug that I showed earlier, so that they can all go to a proper ground, which is actually kind of handy when you're doing mobile operations. One of the big challenges of amateur radio on the road. And zooming into the back of the tuner. Again, a lot of these connections you have to go back and forth and connect and contort yourself into actually putting in place. This is actually Velcroed in because the Z100 does not have a good mounting system. You use heavy-duty Velcro, so this one was actually easy. Since it doesn't have mounting, this Velcro actually worked. I was actually surprised. I didn't think it would stick in the heat, but since there was relatively little heat, it worked out okay. And there, I've just disconnected one of the plugs. Plug that back in. That's mostly it. A lot of lessons learned in this effort. I spent a lot of time researching it and a lot of time building this. I have some pictures from while I was building it. I'll probably post those somewhere as well. I highly recommend if you're going to build a box, it's good to build a big one first. Having the space so you can learn what works and what doesn't is a good thing. Go with something cheap, go with something light, do your research, figure out what you want. This thing has done everything I've needed. I've taken it off the vehicle onto sites, and it never worked perfectly for a number of reasons, but there's always a great deal of potential, and again, I learned a lot. Next radio box will do a lot better. I'll have more mount points for microphones and speakers and things like that, so I can just set the next one on a desk and operate. That's what this one was built for, and it worked okay. Not perfect, but good enough for the prototype.